Yanis, what do you think the chances are of reconvening a new Bretton Woods type conference? And I'll tell you why I asked that question. If I'm in the banking industry, I'm in the brokerage industry, I'm in the finance industry, I really don't care to change anything. I mean, essentially, I can take the money and run and worry about the aftermath, in some faraway place. Why? I've got a lot of power. I'm doing good. Come to Manhattan. You'll see how good it is. Why would I care if I'm a guy in Manhattan and Wall Street? Why would I care about anything changing? Your comments.
Not only will you not care, but you will use every power at your disposal to end such talk of a new Bretton Woods or any kind of global coordination along rational economic lines. Because let's face it, as you put it, Wall Street is doing exceedingly well through this irrationality in action. So the answer to your question, how likely is it, is that it's not very likely, and that's why I remain pessimistic. But our job, Marshall and Scott, is to break down the facade of TINA, the ideology that there is no alternative. What we are in the business of doing, both you in the Henry George School and I in the various realms in which I move, is to show that there are alternatives. There are rational alternatives, that there are obvious alternatives that a good society can and should embrace. Take what, for instance, Henry George would say these days. His suggestion would be that rents resulting from a historical accident that has led some to have ownership over land, they should be taxed. And that means that
we would also say
we should
that
have
the creation of money out of thin air would also be a monopoly that would be susceptible to taxation. We would look at it, not just the land tax, but we would look at monopolies wherever they're created, if they're artificial and they're basically antisocial in nature. So we would go, Scott, why don't you weigh in?
Henry George advocated for public creation of money. In other words, the government creating the money. And since he was a part contemporary of Abraham Lincoln, and Lincoln produced the first United States notes to fight the Civil War, and at which point they became 40% of the currency. This remains an option for us as well. Now, we had United States notes up through 1996 in 14 series, but of course they became marginalized by being so little in the amount. So wouldn't this be an option to fight this kind of hegemony over money, this monopoly of money, to have a public option for money as well, at least domestically, so that the government could create an opportunity and an alternative to the private creation of money by banks. And wouldn't that be a way to get people back to work and to create the jobs in this country that are not being created by the private sector, which seems to want to speculate and to do currency manipulation and so forth instead?
Scott, I have no doubt that if Henry George was alive today, he would be fighting the battle for not just regulating Wall Street, but effectively nationalizing it, or rendering it, so different to what it is today that it would become a servant of the economy, not the major scourge of the economy that it now is. Look, take an example. I mean, we mentioned before, and you mentioned before, Henry George's penchant for taxing monopoly profits and rents, to be more precise. Look at the price of aluminium today. Aluminium is a commodity, is a metal that goes into almost everything, from space rockets to cell phones. Now, we know that there is a bubble in that market, and we know why it is there. We know because that Goldman Sachs and other major financial institutions have directly purchased warehouses where aluminium is being stored, and they're on purpose reducing the outflow rate from those warehouses to companies that have actually paid for the aluminium, and the only reason why they've slowed down the pace at which aluminium is moving out of their warehouses is in order to inflate its price. Now, it is impossible to be a Georgian these days and not to do something about Goldman Sachs. So we have a major battle in our hands, because now, you see, in 1991, communism collapsed. In 2008, capitalism collapsed. We no longer live in a Darwinian kind of market-driven world in which we have the survival of the fittest, however ugly that might be. We have a situation now, after 2008, where the greatest capacity to extract rents goes to the most bankrupt of banks. The more bankrupt they are, the greater their capacity to mobilize the rest of society on their behalf so that they can enhance their rent-seeking behavior and operate like a scourge on the planet. And, you know, I mean, fighting this fight means that you are turning against, you know, very powerful enemies whose power, however, and this is a great irony of our time, is growing the more bankrupt and you know, the greater their failure at their own game. We live in a very irrational world.
This is why I advocate, along with Henry George and other monetary reformists, that we break up the monopoly of money creation itself, and that way the politicians are not going to be bribed by money because they have their own supply. Because it seems that politicians are very cheap in the world of finance that these bankers operate. To buy off Congress is a very modest investment from their point of view.
I agree,
and
Scott,
they'll continue to do it, and there's no reason, as Andy says, why they wouldn't. But the only way to break that, I believe, is to break the monopoly on money as well as the monopoly on land, and land in the expansive sense of meaning all resources.
I agree.
So if we don't take this monopoly power away from the financiers and the rentiers, what hope is there for the actual productive class to have any sort of parity in this society?
Spot on. I agree entirely. But there's one danger in this narrative. Not that I disagree with you, but we have to be very careful how we hone it. Because today, there is, as we all know, there is a Tea Party libertarian argument against the monopoly of money, against the Federal Reserve, against fiat currencies, in favor of a Hayekian blueprint of privatizing money and effectively allowing private banks to issue their own currencies. Now, this libertarian pipe dream, which of course is never going to come to fruition, is a political bulwark against the agenda that you just outlined. So we must be very clear about this. It is not, the problem is not that we have state fiat money. The problem is that we have a federal system, a Federal Reserve System in the United States, a European Central Bank in Europe, which is in the pockets of the private financiers. And the task is not to undo the state's control of money. The point is to strengthen it, but to make the state utilize its control of money on behalf of manufacturers, on behalf of creative people, on behalf of all those whose lives are wrecked as we speak by the rent-seeking behavior of the financiers that control, through the revolving door strategy, the regulators.
So when you talk about having an international system and saying that national borders are a curse, I guess, or what was the term used, that they should not exist, if we get rid of national borders from the financial sense, but we still have them in the political sense, then the bankers will basically be unanswerable to anybody, which it seems like they are already. And maybe the bank, BIS, of Bank of International Settlements, will be the chief banker of the world. But I think that would make things even worse. What's your opinion on that?
I want borders between banking systems. I don't want borders between peoples. It is perfectly possible to throw open the Mexican-United States border for Europe to allow immigrants to come in rather than to be dying in awful little boats off the coast of Lampedusa in Italy, to have free trade of goods that are manufactured here and there and everywhere, while at the same time our financial sectors are prevented from free-flowing capital movements from one financial sector to another. Effectively, I'm calling for a reversal of the present. At the moment, you have freedom of movement for money and no freedom of movement either for people or for goods. I'd like to see this reversed.
Well, I think I agree with you. There should be free-flowing movement of labor and goods. The problem is, well, we'll take Mexico and the United States since you brought it up. Now, under NAFTA, what has happened is that our manufacturing has gone south to Mexico, providing some low-level jobs for them, but not really providing more power or an economic base. Instead, our subsidized agriculture sector has taken over and replaced their farming sector, and basically we ship them cheap food and destroy their agriculture sector in Mexico, and they manufacture cars more cheaply and destroy our manufacturing base in the United States. So it's almost a lose-lose situation, with the only winners being the stock grant corporate suite, including the CEOs who are paid out of rising stock prices based on profits and not production, really, based on rising stock prices. So how do we end this downward spiral where everybody loses except the elite 1%?
Let me give you a couple of examples. You pull down the US-Mexican border. Secondly, you allow Mexico to introduce controls over Monsanto's practices in Mexican agriculture. And thirdly, you stop the crime that is being perpetuated in Mexico as we speak, where 5 international banks, mostly American and Spanish, are choking the Mexican economy of credit, because the Mexican financial sector, as we know, after the previous crisis in Mexico, has been taken over by foreign banks that are using their monopoly power over the credit market of Mexico, not in order to provide it with credit, but in order to starve it from credit, make monopoly banking profits there, then transfer them overseas. So reintroduce capital controls and controls over the financial sector in Mexico, allow Mexican workers to work in the United States, and introduce environmental controls that will force Monsanto to abandon the current predatory practices in Mexican agriculture. These are just 3 examples that sort of roll out of my tongue in response to your very good question.